night of 23rd April 1947, a Royal Navy battleship ran aground off the coast of Cornwall. She was not under enemy fire. There was no crew aboard, no officer on the bridge, no rating at the helm. She was under tow, bound for the Breakers' Yard at Fastlane, Scotland, sold by the Admiralty for £40,000. The tow lines parted in a storm, and HMS Warspite, dragging through the dark water of Prussia Cove, drove herself onto the rocks as if by deliberate act. The salvage contractors spent the next 3 years trying to finish what the Admiralty had ordered. She would not go easily. Sections of her hull were cut away on the beach, hauled off piecemeal, sold as scrap metal at a fraction of the price the Navy had accepted. The final remnants were not cleared until 1950. But here is what makes that grounding worth examining. Warspite had absorbed a torpedo hit at Jutland in 1916 that flooded 2 compartments and jammed her rudder hard over, sending her in circles under the guns of the German high seas fleet. She survived. At Crete in 1941, a 500-kilogram bomb detonated on her forecastle. She reached Alexandria under her own steam. At Salerno in 1943, 2 German radio-guided glider bombs struck her in succession. She made port. No enemy fleet, no Luftwaffe strike, no U-boat had managed to sink her in 31 years of service across 2 world wars. A tow rope in a Cornish storm came closer than any of them. But the real story of HMS Warspite is not the grounding at Prussia Cove. It is the story of what a warship becomes when an empire decides it no longer needs one, and what gets lost when the last generation that understood her value signs the disposal order. The requirement that produced HMS Warspite was driven by a single urgent fact. Germany was building battleships faster than the Royal Navy believed it could answer them. By 1909, the naval arms race between Britain and the Kaiser's Imperial German Navy had become the defining anxiety of British strategic policy. The German Navy laws of 1898 and 1900 had authorized a high seas fleet capable of challenging Royal Navy supremacy in the North Sea. The British response? The Dreadnought Revolution of 1906. The shift to all big gun capital ships had reset the competition. But by 1911, German shipyards were laying down capital ships at a rate that alarmed the Board of Admiralty and produced the famous public agitation, "We want 8 and we won't wait." The answer was the Queen Elizabeth class. 5 battleships, designed not merely to match the German high seas fleet, but to outrun and outgun it simultaneously. The director of naval construction at the time was Sir Eustace Tennyson Dencourt, who had taken the post in 1912. The Queen Elizabeth design represented a step change in British capital ship thinking. Oil-fired boilers replacing coal, 4 twin 15-inch gun turrets instead of the 13.5-inch guns of the preceding Iron Duke class, and a design speed of 25 knots, fast enough to work with the battlecruiser squadrons rather than wait for the slower battle fleet to close. The 15-inch gun itself requires a moment. Each barrel was 54 feet long, roughly the length of 3 double-decker buses placed end to end. It fired a projectile weighing 1,920 pounds over a range of 35,000 yards, 20 miles. At that range, the shell was in the air for approximately 90 seconds. Spotting a fall of shot and correcting for the next salvo required fire control systems of a complexity that barely existed when the design was finalized. HMS Warspite was laid down at Devonport Dockyard on 31st October 1912. The contract value for the class was in the region of £2.5 million per vessel, roughly £320 million at current values. 4 contractors submitted tenders for individual ships. Warspite was Devonport's allocation as a Royal Dockyard build, not a commercial contract, which meant her construction accounts were held within the naval estimates, rather than as a separate line. She was launched on 26 November 1913, with a crowd of dockyard workers and their families gathered on the slipway. She was commissioned into the Royal Navy on 8 March 1915. 4 months after the outbreak of the war, she had been designed to fight. 3 competing design proposals had been examined before the Queen Elizabeth specification was fixed. One advocated retaining coal-fired propulsion to preserve supply chain flexibility. Another proposed reducing the main armament to 13.5-inch guns to save weight and cost. Both were rejected. The decision to commit to oil fuel was, by one account, made personally by the First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill, who argued that the speed advantage it conferred was non-negotiable. That production facility, the oil storage infrastructure at Malta and Gibraltar built to sustain the Queen Elizabeths, would become a strategic asset contested throughout both world wars. Warspite joined the Grand Fleet at Scapa Flow in April 1915. She was, at that moment, the most powerful warship in the Royal Navy. She would hold that distinction, in various configurations, for the next decade. She was also, as her first captain would note in his quarterly report to the Admiralty, prone to steering problems at high speed. That note would prove consequential within 14 months. To understand what made HMS Warspite something more than a capable warship, it is necessary to understand what the Queen Elizabeth class represented structurally, and then to understand what the Great Refit of 1934 to 1937 made of what remained. The Queen Elizabeth class hull, 645 feet 9 inches in length, 90 feet 6 inches in beam, was designed around a principle of concentrated firepower over a wide arc. The 4 twin turrets were arranged in a super-firing pair forward and a super-firing pair aft, meaning the second turret in each pair was elevated above the first, allowing both to fire simultaneously over a wider bearing. This allowed all 8 15-inch guns to be brought to bear in a broadside, generating a total weight of shot of 15,360 pounds per salvo. The armor protection scheme was belt and deck, a 13-inch waterline belt of Krupp-cemented armor, the hardest, face-hardened steel then available, tapering to 6 inches at the bow and stern, with a 3-inch armored deck over the machinery spaces. The turret faces were 11 inches thick. The conning tower was 11 inches of steel. Against anything the German Navy deployed in 1915, this was adequate. Against the bomb loads of the 1940s, it would prove imperfect, but not fatal, as events at Crete and Salerno would demonstrate. The propulsion system is where the oil fuel decision paid its dividend. 4 Parsons steam turbines, a turbine being a device in which high-pressure steam is directed onto blades arranged around a central shaft. Spinning the shaft, and thus the propeller, drove 4 shafts, producing 75,000 shaft horsepower. At full power, Warspite achieved 25.1 knots on her trials, roughly 29 miles per hour through water. Against the 21-knot maximum of German battleships of the same period, that margin was decisive. But it is the refit of 1934 to 1937 at Portsmouth that defines the ship that fought the Second World War. By the early 1930s, the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 had frozen capital ship construction and imposed displacement limits that prevented wholesale replacement of the existing battle fleet. The Admiralty's answer was modernization. Warspite was selected as the first of the Queen Elizabeths to undergo full reconstruction, a process that cost £2.36 million at 1934 values, roughly £180 million at current equivalents, and took 32 months. The changes were fundamental. The original coal-capable boilers were replaced entirely by 6 Admiralty 3-drum boilers of modern design, reducing the funnel count from 2 to 1 and saving weight. The main machinery was rearranged to improve underwater protection. Anti-torpedo bulges, external blisters fitted along the waterline to absorb torpedo detonations before they reached the hull proper, were deepened and reinforced. The secondary armament was entirely replaced. The original 6-inch guns were removed and replaced with 20 4.5-inch dual-purpose guns in twin mountings, capable of engaging both surface targets and aircraft. Most significantly, the fire control systems were replaced with the latest director control tower equipment, and an aircraft control position was added above the bridge. High-angle directors, the systems that pointed guns at aircraft rather than ships, were fitted for the first time. After reconstruction, Warspite could engage targets at 35,000 yards on the surface and aircraft at altitudes up to 15,000 feet. Neither capability had existed on the original ship. She emerged from Portsmouth in 1937, drawing 36,600 tons fully laden, 3,000 tons heavier than she had entered, but faster, better protected, and incomparably better armed for the war that the Naval Intelligence Division already suspected was coming. The test program for the rebuilt systems was conducted off the west coast of Scotland and in the Channel approaches. The director control trials at Portland Bill in late 1937 recorded a mean time of 68 seconds from target designation to first salvo, a figure that the gunnery staff at Portsmouth considered satisfactory. The 4.5-inch anti-aircraft batteries were tested at Whale Island, Portsmouth, against towed target drogues. 3 of the 4 mounting positions achieved first salvo bracket solutions against targets moving at 180 knots. When Warspite recommissioned into the Mediterranean Fleet in 1937 under Rear Admiral Andrew Cunningham, she was, by the assessment of the naval staff, the most capable British capital ship then in commission. The program had its champion, and the Mediterranean had its flagship. HMS Warspite's operational record across 2 world wars is by any measure without parallel in the Royal Navy's 20th century history. She accumulated 15 battle honors, more than any other warship to have served under the White Ensign. That figure is not decoration. Each honor represents a specific action, a specific date, a specific weight of enemy fire directed at her hull. The first came at Jutland on 31st May 1916. The Grand Fleet engaged the German High Seas Fleet in the North Sea, approximately 60 miles off the coast of Denmark. Warspite was the 5th ship of the 5th Battle Squadron, 4 Queen Elizabeth-class battleships operating with Vice Admiral David Beattie's battlecruiser force. At approximately 18:15 hours, as the British line was turning away under heavy German fire, Warspite's steering gear jammed. Her rudder locked hard to starboard. She began turning in circles, directly in front of the German line, presenting her broadside to the concentrated fire of the High Seas Fleet at close range. The German gunnery was accurate. At least 13 large-caliber shells struck Warspite during those minutes. The precise count remains disputed between German and British records, with figures ranging from 13 to 15 hits. Both forward turrets were damaged. Fires broke out on the upper deck. 102 officers and men were killed or wounded. But the armor held at every critical point. Her machinery spaces were untouched. She reached Rosyth under her own power, listing 7 degrees to port, and was back in service within 6 weeks. In the Second World War, she fought in every major theatre in which the Royal Navy was committed. In April 1940, during the Norwegian campaign, Warspite led a destroyer flotilla up Ofotfjord to Narvik, a fjord being a long, narrow inlet cut between steep cliffs, extending 40 miles inland from the Norwegian coast. At the Second Battle of Narvik on 13 April 1940, her aircraft, a Swordfish floatplane operated from the ship's catapult, became the first aircraft in history to sink an enemy submarine in wartime, torpedoing U-64 in the fjord. Warspite's own guns accounted for 7 German destroyers in the same action. On 9 July 1940, at the Battle of Calabria off the Calabrian coast of southern Italy, Warspite scored a hit on the Italian battleship Giulio Cesare at a range of 26,000 yards, approximately 15 miles. It remains one of the longest-range gunnery hits ever recorded in naval combat. The Italian fleet withdrew. The engagement confirmed British naval ascendancy in the central Mediterranean at a moment when that ascendancy was by no means certain. At Cape Matapan, on the night of 28-29 March 1941, Warspite operated with HMS Barham and HMS Valiant in a night engagement off the southern tip of Greece. Radar, a system then still new to surface gunnery, in which radio pulses were transmitted and their reflected returns used to measure the range and bearing of targets in darkness, guided the British squadron onto a force of Italian cruisers. 3 heavy cruisers, Zara, Pola, and Fiume, were sunk. The action cost the Italian Navy 2,303 men. British casualties were 3 men killed. The damage Warspite absorbed in the summer of 1941 tested the limits of what the Portsmouth refit had achieved. In May 1941, during the withdrawal from Crete, she was struck by a 500-kilogram bomb from a Junkers Ju-88 that penetrated to the boiler room spaces. The resultant flooding reduced her to 18 knots and flooded 1 boiler room. She reached Alexandria under her own power and was repaired at Puget Sound Navy Yard in the United States, the only Royal Navy capital ship repaired in American yards during the war, returning to service in December 1941. By 1943, she was operating in the central Mediterranean under the command of the 15th Cruiser Squadron's covering force for the Allied landings in Sicily and Italy. At Salerno, on 16 September 1943, the Luftwaffe introduced a weapon for which no existing countermeasure had been designed: the Fritz X, a 1,400-kilogram radio-guided glider bomb, released from high altitude and steered onto the target by a specialist operator in the launching aircraft, using a joystick. 2 Fritz X bombs struck Warspite in rapid succession. The first penetrated 6 decks and exited through the double bottom without exploding, but the water pressure at that depth caused catastrophic flooding of the boiler rooms. The second detonated on the armored deck, killing 9 men and wounding 14. All power was lost. She drifted for 4 hours before salvage tugs took her in tow. She was brought into Malta, patched, and then towed to Gibraltar, then to Rosyth. She returned to service for one final act. On 6 June 1944, HMS Warspite took up her bombardment position off Gold Beach, Normandy. Her role was shore bombardment, firing her 15-inch guns at German coastal batteries, troop concentrations, and reinforcement routes in support of the British 50th Infantry Division. She fired 235 rounds of 15-inch shell on D-Day and the days that followed. At one point, her accuracy was confirmed by a forward observation officer ashore to within 75 yards of the designated target at a range of 22,000 yards. She was, by 1944, 32 years old. 3 of her 4 turrets were functioning at Normandy. The 4th had been damaged at Salerno and never fully restored. Her maximum speed had fallen to approximately 18 knots. The anti-aircraft directors were aging, but her guns still worked, and her accuracy was undiminished. At peak, between 1939 and 1944, the ship's company numbered approximately 1,200 officers and ratings. The supply chain to keep her in operation, fuel oil, 15-inch propellant charges, 15-inch shells, aviation spirit for the catapult aircraft, food, medical stores, sustained employment across dockyards at Devonport, Portsmouth, Rosyth, Alexandria, and Trincomalee. The gunpowder factory at Waltham Abbey, Essex, produced the cordite propellant charges her guns consumed. The shell forges at Sheffield and Barrow filled her magazines. In 1944, the naval staff began a quiet review of which capital ships would be retained into the post-war fleet. Warspite did not feature in any of the retention scenarios. The review noted that her repairs would require approximately £1.5 million at 1944 values to bring her to full operational standard. The Treasury's view, communicated through the Board of Admiralty's Finance Committee in late 1944, was that the expenditure could not be justified for a ship of her age and condition. The shore bombardment role, for which she was still fit, would be required for at most 18 months more. The first signs of the end were filed quietly. There was no parliamentary statement, no press release, just a memorandum dated November 1944, noting that HMS Warspite would not be included in the post-war mobilization plan. The formal decision to dispose of HMS Warspite was not made in a single moment. It was made in a series of Admiralty memoranda between November 1944 and January 1946, each one closing a door, each one narrowing the options, each one quietly removing from consideration the possibility that the ship might be preserved, retained, or converted to another role. The strategic context was clear enough. The sinking of HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse by Japanese land-based aircraft on 10 December 1941, two capital ships lost in 2 hours without a single enemy surface vessel present, had confirmed what the theorists at the Naval War College had argued since 1921. The battleship's era of dominance was over. Air power had made the unescorted capital ship a liability. The carriers that had replaced them as the fleet's striking arm required investment that the post-war British economy could not sustain across both new construction and the maintenance of a surviving battle fleet. The Attlee government's defense estimates for 1946 to 47, drawn up by the Chancellor, Hugh Dalton, under conditions of severe austerity. Britain's external debt in 1945 stood at approximately £3.5 billion, the equivalent of roughly 200% of annual GDP, required reductions across every service that the pre-war establishment would have considered unthinkable. The Royal Navy's capital ship strength was to be reduced from its wartime peak of 15 operational vessels to 4. The modernized battleships Vanguard and Anson, and 2 in reserve. Warspite was not among them. The question of preservation was raised, by one account, within the Naval Historical Branch in late 1945. A brief was prepared examining the practicality of retaining the ship as a museum vessel, as the Americans had done with USS Constitution and later USS Missouri. The brief concluded that the costs of preservation maintenance, estimated at approximately £80,000 per year, were not justifiable given the post-war housing crisis and the priority demands on public expenditure. Whether this brief ever reached ministerial level is not confirmed in the publicly available Admiralty files at the National Archives. What is confirmed is the sequence that followed. January 1946. Warspite was placed on the disposal list. March 1946. The Admiralty accepted a tender of £40,000 from Metal Industries Limited of Glasgow. Scrap value for 31,000 tons of steel. August 1946. The order was issued to begin stripping the ship of all reusable equipment, fire control instruments, navigational equipment, stores, and serviceable fittings. The 15-inch guns were examined for potential reuse. The Vickers Armstrong's assessment found them beyond economical reconditioning. They were to be cut up with the hull. 2nd, 1946. The ship's company was paid off. The last officer signed the log. The last rating left the gangway. January 1947. Towing preparations began at Portsmouth. April 1947. The tow commenced. 2 ocean-going tugs, Melinda and Bustler, took the lines. The storm came up off Land's End. The tow parted. Warspite drove onto the rocks of Prussia Cove. The salvage assessment was clear. She could not be refloated intact. The scrapping would proceed on the beach, section by section, frame by frame. The forepart of the ship was cut away in 1947. The midship section went in 1948. The stern, where the 15-inch turrets had once sat, was cleared in 1950. The last steel from HMS Warspite left Cornwall in 1950. It was sold as scrap. No ceremony, no parliamentary tribute, no naval gun salute. The ship that had held the line at Jutland, sunk 7 destroyers at Narvik, hit a battleship at 15 miles, survived the Fritz 10 at Salerno, and put 235 rounds into the beaches at Normandy, was recycled into, by various accounts, motor car bodywork and domestic appliances. The Admiralty's file on the disposal was closed in 1950. The reference is ADM 116/5790, held at the National Archives, Kew. It is 11 pages long. HMS Warspite's lasting influence on British naval thinking operates at 2 levels. One technical, one institutional. and neither is commemorated with a plaque. The technical legacy is the fire control doctrine developed aboard her during the interwar period and refined under combat conditions in the Mediterranean. The director-control methods used at Cape Matapan in 1941, where radar data was fed into fire control tables and translated into gun elevation and bearing corrections in near real time, formed the procedural basis for the surface gunnery systems fitted to the County-class destroyers, and later the Type 82 Bristol, the first British destroyer designed from the outset around a computerized action information system. The principle is continuous. Sensor data, processed centrally, distributed to weapons. Warspite's 1937 fire control suite was the analog ancestor of the digital combat management systems fitted to the Type 45 destroyer today. The operational legacy is the shore bombardment doctrine, refined at Sicily, Salerno, and Normandy. The coordination between forward observation officers ashore, naval gunfire liaison teams attached to infantry brigades, and the fire control rooms of bombarding vessels was developed, in its modern British form, during those 1943-44 operations. That doctrine was still being taught at the Maritime Warfare School at HMS Collingwood in Portsmouth as recently as the 1982 Falklands campaign, when HMS Glamorgan and HMS Antelope provided naval gunfire support to Commando Brigade ashore. The human footnote belongs to Vice Admiral Sir Henry Pridham Whipple, who commanded the cruiser force at Cape Matapan. After the battle, in which Warspite's gunnery had been decisive, Pridham Whipple was tasked with preparing the official after-action report. His assessment of the night engagement, filed with the Admiralty in April 1941, noted specifically that the accuracy of Warspite's 15-inch fire in darkness, guided by radar data that none of the gun crews had been trained to interpret directly, had been the determining factor. He attributed it, without elaboration, to the quality of the ship's transmitting station personnel, the ratings, who manned the mechanical fire control computers below decks, unseen and unnamed in any subsequent account. Those men were never individually identified in any public record. Their names are not on a memorial. Their contribution is noted in a single paragraph of an Admiralty report that spent 40 years in a closed file. The honest verdict on HMS Warspite, delivered in aggregate by the naval historians Norman Friedman, D.K. Brown, and the staff of the Naval Historical Branch, is this: she was a ship that consistently exceeded what her design had promised, in conditions more extreme than her designers had envisaged, across a span of service so long that she fought under 3 different propulsion configurations and 4 different fire control systems. No design fault killed her. No mechanical failure ended her career. The decision that scrapped her was made on economic grounds that were real, justified in the context of 1946, and arguably necessary given the state of the public finances. That does not make the outcome less final. The 15 battle honors she accumulated between 1916 and 1944, Jutland, Narvik, Calabria, Matapan, Crete, Malta convoys, Libya, Sicilian waters, Salerno, Aegean, English Channel, Normandy, and others, represent a continuous operational record unmatched by any warship flying the White Ensign in the 20th century. The Royal Navy has not since produced a warship that came within reach of that number. What was lost when the last steel cleared Prussia Cove was not merely a ship. It was the last vessel in commission that had been designed, built, rebuilt, and fought by the generation that had created British maritime power at its zenith, and the institutional knowledge that resided not in its hull, but in the men who had learned, through 30 years and 2 world wars, exactly what that hull could withstand. If you found this history valuable, give the video a like. It's the single best signal you can send this channel. And if you want more stories about the ships, aircraft, and decisions that shaped British military power, subscribe to UK Defence Archive. We'll see you in the next one. Off the coast of Normandy, on the morning of 6 June 1944, the guns of HMS Warspite opened fire at 05:53 hours, the muzzle blast visible from the beaches 3 miles distant. each 15-inch shell tracing its arc over the channel and falling on the German battery at Ver-sur-Mer with a precision that the forward observation officer ashore, crouching in the dunes with a radio handset, reported back to the ship in a single word: on.